Just before 4 o'clock in the morning on June 6, 1944, a German artillery major stood at his forward observation post carved into the cliffs above the Normandy coastline, staring through his binoculars into the darkness and mist of the English Channel. For weeks, months even, he had peered out into that same grey void and seen nothing but empty water. But in those final minutes before dawn broke over France, what he saw made his blood run cold. The sea was no longer empty. It was filled from one horizon to the other with ships, thousands of them. Warships, transports, landing craft, destroyers, battleships. An armada so vast it seemed impossible, a hallucination born of too many sleepless nights on the Norman cliffs. He reached for the telephone with shaking hands and rang his divisional headquarters. When the duty officer picked up, the major's voice was barely recognizable. He said, and these words have echoed through history ever since, that there must be 10,000 ships out there. It was the largest seaborne invasion in human history, and this one German major was the first to see it coming. His name was Werner Pluscat, and this is his story, but it is also the story of every German commander, officer, and soldier who stood in the path of the Allied tide on that world-changing morning, who had to confront a moment they had been dreading and preparing for, and who found that all their preparation was not enough. What happened to these men? The generals asleep at war games, the field marshal celebrating his wife's birthday far from the front, the paratroop officers who crashed into hedgerows in the dark, the tank commanders who begged for permission to counterattack and were refused, the defenders of bunkers on beaches that would forever carry the names of American states, when the greatest invasion in history swept over them. In this video we will find out. So, without further ado, let's start with the first name on our list. Werner Pluscat was born on January 26, 1912, in Coastline, a town in what was then the German province of Pomerania, now part of northwestern Poland. He came of age in the turbulent Weimar Republic years, a period of economic devastation and political instability that shaped an entire generation of young Germans who would eventually find themselves pulled into the orbit of the Third Reich. Pluscat pursued a military career in the Wehrmacht, the conventional German armed forces, working his way through the artillery branch with the steady professionalism that characterized so many of his fellow officers. He was not a man of the SS, not a party fanatic, not a figure associated with the ideological machinery of Nazism. He was, in the truest sense, a professional soldier, trained in the art of directing artillery fire, reading terrain, and coordinating firepower with infantry operations. By the time the war had reached its critical phase in late 1943 and early 1944, Pluscat held the rank of major and commanded the 1st Battalion of Artillery Regiment 352, a unit attached to the 352nd Infantry Division that had been deployed along the Normandy coastline in the spring of 1944. The 352nd Infantry Division was itself something of a surprise development, a relatively experienced division that had been moved up to reinforce the Norman coast in March 1944, replacing a single static regiment with a full combat division that Allied intelligence had failed to detect. This intelligence failure would have catastrophic consequences on the beaches below Pluscat's observation post on the morning of June 6th. Pluscat's forward observation post was located at Pointe de la Percée, a promontory of chalk cliffs jutting out into the English Channel between the Vire estuary to the west and the coastal town of Port-en-Bessin to the east. From this elevated vantage point, on a clear day, Pluscat could see for miles across the channel. His post was equipped with range-finding equipment, communications, links to his artillery batteries positioned further inland, and the standard paraphernalia of a coastal observation officer: binoculars, maps, charts, and a direct telephone line to divisional headquarters. Pluscat was intimately familiar with the coastline below him. The beach stretching to his east and northeast, a long, wide crescent of grey sand backed by bluffs, and dominated at its eastern end by the fortified village of Colleville-sur-Mer, was an area he had studied intensely. He knew the tidal patterns, the beach gradients, the defensive obstacles that German engineers had spent months constructing under the orders of Field Marshal Rommel. He knew where his guns could reach and where they could not. What he did not know, in the weeks and months leading up to June 6th, was exactly when the Allies would come, or exactly where they would choose to strike along the roughly 2,000 miles of occupied European coastline that Germany was expected to defend. In the months before D-Day, Pluscat lived the peculiar life of a man waiting for catastrophe. He would later describe this period in interviews and in accounts given to the filmmaker Cornelius Ryan, who spent years gathering first-hand testimonies for his landmark book, The Longest Day, published in 1959. Pluscat told Ryan that the waiting was in some ways worse than the event itself. The endless nights at the observation post, scanning an empty sea, phoning in reports of nothing, then returning to his billet at the Château de Vaumicelle, a comfortable manor house a few kilometres from the coast that served as his quarters and those of several fellow officers. On the night of June 5th to 6th, 1944, Pluscat had been at a party. The details of this gathering have been recounted slightly differently across various sources, but the essential picture is consistent. On what would be the last night of relative peace on the Norman coast, German officers were socialising, playing cards, drinking wine from the well-stocked cellars that occupied France still somehow provided. Pluscat returned to his observation post in the early hours of June 6th. The night was overcast, the sea choppy from the recent storms that had already caused Allied planners to postpone the invasion by one day. Conditions seemed unsuitable for a major amphibious operation. Pluscat's division, along with virtually every other German formation in Normandy, had received no particular alerts. The weather, German meteorologists believed, made an invasion unlikely. Then the bombers came. In the hours before dawn, waves of Allied aircraft began to appear over the Norman coast, their engines filling the darkness with a thunder that rattled windows and shook the earth. Pluscat could see the anti-aircraft fire rising from German positions, tracer rounds stitching patterns against the cloud cover, bursts of flak lighting up the sky. He knew something significant was happening, but the exact nature of what was coming was still unclear. German anti-aircraft activity had intensified across a wide area, and reports of Allied paratroopers landing were beginning to filter in from the areas around Sainte-Mère-Église and the Orne River mouth. But these could still be interpreted, by those who wished to see them that way, as diversionary raids or the preliminary probing of defences, rather than the opening moves of the long-anticipated full invasion. It was when Pluscat turned his binoculars toward the sea at approximately 3:45 in the morning that his world changed forever. The mist had partially cleared and the grey pre-dawn light was just beginning to hint at the horizon. What he saw defied comprehension. The English Channel was covered in ships, not a fleet, not a task force, not the kind of naval concentration he had theoretically expected and had seen in intelligence briefings as a possibility, but something so enormous, so overwhelming, so completely beyond the scale of anything his experience had prepared him for, that for a moment he simply could not process it. The ships stretched in every direction as far as his binoculars could reach. There were warships of every size, from massive battleships down to the smallest patrol craft. There were hundreds, possibly thousands of transport vessels and landing craft. There were destroyers circling like sheepdogs around the flanks of the Great Fleet. There were barrage balloons floating above the armada to protect against air attack. There were so many vessels that the sea itself seemed to have been replaced by steel. Pluscat telephoned divisional headquarters immediately. The duty officer who answered was Colonel Ocker, and Pluscat's words, as reconstructed from his later testimony and dramatised in the 1962 film The Longest Day, were stark in their simplicity. He reported that the invasion fleet was visible from his post and that the scale of it was beyond anything they had anticipated. The response from divisional headquarters was initially one of scepticism. Surely he was exaggerating. Surely it could not be as large as all that. Pluscat reportedly invited his superiors to come and look for themselves. He was not exaggerating. What he was witnessing was the assembled might of Operation Overlord, approximately 6,939 vessels of all types, including 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft and ships, 736 ancillary vessels, and 864 merchant vessels, carrying approximately 156,000 Allied troops who would land on 5 beaches across a 50-mile front before the day was over. As the ships began to maneuver into position and the naval bombardment opened up with a roar that shook the very cliffs beneath Pluscat's feet, he understood with absolute clarity that this was not a feint, not a diversion, not a limited raid. This was the invasion. This was the day they had been dreading. The hours that followed were among the most dramatic and terrible of Pluscat's life. From his observation post, he had a ringside view of the naval bombardment that preceded the landings. The battleships USS Texas, USS Arkansas, the British cruiser HMS Belfast, and dozens of other warships opened fire on the German positions along the coastline. And the sound and fury of their salvos were unlike anything Pluscat had experienced even after years of war. Shells the size of automobiles shrieked overhead and detonated with earth-shaking concussions. The cliffs themselves seemed to tremble. When the first landing craft began their approach toward the beach below, the beach that was designated on Allied maps as Omaha, Pluscat directed his artillery as best he could, calling in fire coordinates and attempting to bring the guns of his battalion to bear on the approaching assault waves. But the problem for the German defenders was that so many of their prepared positions had already been struck by the bombardment, communications had been disrupted by the shelling, and the sheer number of approaching craft made it impossible to concentrate fire effectively on any single point. Furthermore, Pluscat himself was in increasing personal danger as Allied fire began to walk up the cliffs toward his observation post. He was forced to abandon his position before the morning was out, moving back toward the inland areas as the Allied assault secured a foothold on the beach below. What happened to Werner Pluscat after D-Day is, in its own way, a remarkable story. He survived the Normandy campaign, which was itself no small achievement given the ferocity of the fighting, the Allied air superiority that made daylight movement almost suicidal for German formations, and the grinding attrition of the hedgerow battles that followed the initial landings. The 352nd Infantry Division, of which his artillery battalion was a part, fought through the summer of 1944, suffering catastrophic losses as the Wehrmacht attempted to contain and then escape the Allied breakout from Normandy. Pluscat was eventually taken, prisoner, captured by Allied forces somewhere during the campaigns that followed the Normandy breakout. He spent time as a prisoner of war but was released in the years after the war's end and returned to civilian life in West Germany. Unlike many of his counterparts who had held higher rank or been associated with atrocities, Pluscat faced no war crimes charges. He was a conventional artillery officer who had fought a conventional defensive battle, and the record of his service during D-Day itself was one of professional military duty rather than criminal conduct. The most remarkable postscript to Pluscat's story is his relationship with the retelling of the D-Day story. When Cornelius Ryan was researching The Longest Day in the late 1950s, he sought out veterans from both sides who had been present during the invasion. Pluscat was one of the German veterans who spoke with Ryan extensively, providing detailed first-hand testimony about what he had seen and experienced in the hours before and during the landings. His account of standing at his observation post and seeing the invasion fleet approach became one of the most vivid and frequently quoted passages in the book. When Darrell F. Zanuck produced the epic film adaptation in 1962, Pluscat's story was among the segments dramatized on screen. The German actor Hans Christian Blech portrayed Pluscat in the film, and the scene in which a stunned German major stands at his binoculars watching the ships fill the horizon became one of the most memorable moments in a film packed with memorable moments. There is something deeply poignant about the fact that Pluscat himself reportedly advised on certain aspects of the film's production, and that he lived to see himself portrayed in one of the most celebrated war films ever made. Werner Pluscat died on June 29, 1986, at the age of 74. He had outlived the war by more than 4 decades, had seen Germany divided and then beginning its long path toward reconciliation with its former enemies, and had witnessed the transformation of the beach below his old observation post into one of the most visited memorial sites in the world. The man who first saw D-Day coming died peacefully in a post-war world that his terrible morning in 1944 had helped to create. But Pluscat was not alone on the Norman cliffs that morning. Across the entire invasion front, in command posts and forward positions, in divisional headquarters and at army group level, German officers and men were waking to the reality of what was happening. And their stories of confusion and courage, of missed opportunities and desperate counterattacks, of trials and imprisonment, and sometimes of justice long delayed, are equally worth telling. Who was the first German general to learn of the paratroop landings? What was happening at the headquarters of the German 7th Army in the crucial hours before dawn? And where was the one German general who might have been able to stop the invasion before it gained its foothold? One of the first senior German officers to receive reports of Allied parachute troops landing in Normandy was Major Friedrich Hein, the intelligence officer, or IC, to use the German designation, of the 84th Corps, the corps-level headquarters responsible for the defence of the Normandy coastline under General Erich Marx. Heydte was a professional staff officer of considerable intelligence and organisational ability, the kind of man who spent his working hours synthesising reports, analysing Allied intentions from fragments of intelligence, and briefing his commanding general on the most likely threats and scenarios. In the early hours of June 6th, it was Heydte's job to make sense of the cascade of incoming reports and determine whether what was happening represented the real invasion or yet another of the probing raids and diversionary operations that had kept German defenders on edge for months. What made Heydte's situation particularly remarkable that night was the context in which the news first reached him. General Erich Marx, his commanding officer, was at that moment hosting a birthday dinner at his headquarters in Saint-Lô. It was Marx's 53rd birthday, and despite the strains of the war and the constant pressure of commanding the most strategically vital stretch of the Atlantic Wall, he had permitted himself the small luxury of a celebration with his staff. The wine was poured, the conversation was flowing, and the officers of 84th Corps were enjoying a brief moment of civilization in the middle of a war. Then, the first reports came in of Allied paratroopers landing. Heydte was among the first to receive these reports and to bring them to his general's attention. The birthday dinner was over. Friedrich Heydte's career as an intelligence officer meant that he had access to a great deal of sensitive information about German defensive dispositions and Allied intelligence capabilities. After the war, the Allies were naturally very interested in what German intelligence officers knew and how they had gathered their information, and figures like Heydte found themselves subjected to extensive debriefing by Allied intelligence services. Heydte survived the war and was held for interrogation in the immediate post-war period. He was not among the officers prosecuted for war crimes. His role had been that of an intelligence analyst rather than a commander who had issued criminal orders. He was eventually released and returned to West Germany. Heydte later made a significant contribution to the historical record of D-Day by writing a detailed account of his experiences as the 84th Corps intelligence officer, providing one of the few first-hand German staff perspectives on the events of June 5th to 6th, 1944. His memoir, combined with his testimony to historians like Cornelius Ryan, helped fill in crucial gaps in the German side of the D-Day narrative. The document that Heydte produced, describing the confusion and chaos in the German command structure in the hours after the first landings, is a remarkable primary source that historians of the Normandy campaign continue to draw upon decades after its composition. The man whose birthday was so dramatically interrupted on the night of June 5th to 6th, 1944, was one of the most remarkable and in some ways tragic German commanders of the Second World War. General Erich Marx was born in Berlin on June 6, 1891, which meant that on the day the Allies chose for their great invasion, he was celebrating his 53rd birthday, a cosmic coincidence that has struck historians and storytellers ever since. He came from a family with strong intellectual traditions. His father was a distinguished historian, and Erich himself combined his military career with a genuine life of the mind, reading widely, thinking carefully, and bringing to his work as a staff officer and later as a combat commander an analytical intelligence that set him apart from the more purely operational thinkers who dominated the German officer corps. He served with distinction in the First World War, rising through the ranks of the Imperial German Army, and continued his career through the turbulent years of the Weimar Republic, surviving the political upheavals and reductions in force that destroyed many military careers during that period. By the time of the Second World War, Marx had established himself as one of the most capable staff officers in the Wehrmacht. In 1940, he produced the initial planning document for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, a plan that was largely set aside in favour of other concepts, but that demonstrated the scope of his strategic thinking. He fought on the Eastern Front, where he was severely wounded, losing his right leg. This wound might have ended the career of a less determined man, but Marx returned to active duty equipped with a prosthetic limb, displaying the kind of physical courage and sheer determination that earned him the respect of those who served under him. By 1944, he was commanding 84th Corps in Normandy, responsible for the defence of the beaches that would become famous to history as Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Marx was among the German commanders who took the Allied invasion threat most seriously and who prepared as thoroughly as resources allowed. He had conducted exercises and war games designed to simulate Allied landings, and he had studied the Normandy coastline with professional thoroughness. He was not caught intellectually flat-footed on June 6th, even if his birthday dinner was interrupted. When reports of the Allied airborne landings began to reach his headquarters in St. Lo in the early hours of June 6th, Marx acted quickly. He contacted the 7th Army headquarters and argued that the reports represented the beginning of the real invasion rather than a diversion. He was initially met with skepticism from some. Quarters. The perennial problem of German command in the Normandy period was that nobody could agree on whether what was happening was the main event or a feint designed to draw German reserves away from the real objective, which many German officers, including Hitler himself, continued to believe would be directed at the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. But Marx pressed his case with urgency and began to order what counterattacking forces he had available into motion. He wanted to drive the Allied paratroopers back into the sea before they could consolidate their positions, understanding that if the airborne lodgements were allowed to develop, they would provide the flanking protection that the seaborne invasion needed to come ashore and expand. The tragedy of Marx's situation was that the counterattack forces he had available were wholly inadequate to the scale of the task. The armoured divisions that might have smashed the Allied paratroopers in the dark and driven them. Back before the seaborne landings reinforced them were under the control of OKW, the German High Command, and could not be committed without Hitler's personal authorization that would not come until the following afternoon, by which time the Allies had secured their beachheads and the moment for a decisive armoured counterattack had passed. Marx spent the day of June 6th fighting a desperate defensive battle against overwhelming odds, attempting to direct his limited forces against multiple simultaneous crises across a front of hundreds of kilometres. He was killed on June 12, 1944, just 6 days after his 53rd birthday, when Allied aircraft attacked his staff car as he was travelling between command posts. He was on his way to the front lines to personally assess the situation when the fighter bombers struck. Erich Marx, the man whose birthday happened to fall on the day that history chose for D-Day, died in action before he could see how the Normandy battle concluded. He never faced any post-war tribunal, never had to answer for his role in the defence of occupied France. His death in the field, doing his duty as a soldier, spared him the complications of post-war reckoning that awaited so many of his colleagues. His story is one of those D-Day ironies that seem almost too perfect for fiction. A man whose life and death were so completely defined by a single date. General Friedrich Dolman was the commander of the German 7th Army, the formation directly responsible for the defence of Normandy. He was 62 years old in June 1944, a Bavarian-born officer who had served in the First World War and built a long and generally distinguished career in the German army. He had commanded the 7th Army since October 1939, an unusually long tenure that reflected both his competence and his ability to navigate the political currents of the Nazi military hierarchy. Under his command, the 7th Army was responsible for defending the long stretch of coastline from the Loire River estuary in the south to roughly the boundary between Normandy and the Pas-de-Calais region in the north, a vast area that included the beaches of Normandy and the Cotentin Peninsula with its vital port of Cherbourg. Dolman had done his best to fortify this coastline with the resources available to him, working alongside Rommel to accelerate the construction of beach obstacles, minefields and defensive positions that together comprised the Atlantic Wall in the Normandy sector. What made Dolman's position peculiarly difficult in the days leading up to D-Day was the weather. The storms of early June 1944 had convinced German meteorologists that conditions were unsuitable for an amphibious invasion, and on the basis of this assessment, Dolman had made a decision that would haunt his memory for the rest of his short remaining life. He had ordered a large-scale command exercise and war game to be held at Rennes in Brittany, and had summoned many of his key divisional commanders to attend. The exercise was scheduled to begin on June 6th. When the Allied paratroopers began landing in the early hours of that morning, many of the senior German commanders who should have been at their headquarters in Normandy were instead on the road to Rennes or had already arrived there. It was one of the most unfortunate coincidences, though some historians have argued it was not entirely coincidental, suggesting that Allied intelligence may have deliberately chosen June 6th, knowing that the command exercise would pull German commanders away from their posts in the history of the Normandy campaign. Dolman received word of the landings in the early hours of June 6th and immediately began trying to recall his commanders and organise a coherent defensive response. The problem was that the 7th Army headquarters, like virtually every German command post in Normandy that morning, was flooded with contradictory and often wildly inaccurate reports. Some reports described massive Allied airborne landings across a broad front. Others suggested that the paratroopers were scattered and disorganized, implying perhaps a mishap rather than a coherent plan. Reports of the naval bombardment competed with reports about the commando operations and the resistance movements, and underneath all of it was the persistent question that paralyzed German decision-making throughout the crucial early hours. Was this the real invasion, or was it a feint? Dolman pushed for authorization to commit his mobile reserves to counterattack, but like Marx at the corps level, he was hamstrung by the German command structure that placed the most important armoured reserves under Hitler's personal control. The Führer would not be woken with the first reports of the landings. His staff, knowing his mercurial temper and his insistence on controlling all significant decisions personally, were reluctant to disturb his sleep on the basis of what might still turn out to be a large-scale raid rather than the actual invasion. The Normandy campaign went badly for Dolman from the very beginning, and as the Allied lodgement expanded through June and into early July, the pressure on the 7th Army became almost unbearable. The fall of Cherbourg on June 26, 1944, was a particular blow. The great port that had been supposed to supply the Allied forces as they pushed inland fell to the Americans after a bitter defence, and its loss represented a strategic defeat that could not be disguised or explained away. Dolman faced the prospect of being held accountable for the failure to hold Cherbourg and for the broader deterioration of the German position in Normandy. He died on June 28, 1944, just 2 days after the fall of Cherbourg. The official German announcement described his death as being caused by a heart attack, and this is the explanation that most historians accept. However, there have been persistent rumours and some circumstantial evidence suggesting that Dolman may have taken his own life rather than face the consequences of the defeats under his command. The exact circumstances of his death remain somewhat unclear, and the question of whether he died of natural causes or chose to end his life rather than face censure, or worse from Hitler, has never been definitively resolved. What is certain is that Friedrich Dolman died with the Normandy battle still raging, never having to face a post-war tribunal. His army was in retreat, his career was effectively over, and the cause for which he had devoted his professional life was on the path to destruction. Major Max Pemsel was one of the unsung heroes, or perhaps more accurately, one of the unsung competent professionals of the German side of the D-Day story. As the Chief of Staff of the 7th Army, Pemsel occupied a position that made him, in practical terms, the man who ran the army headquarters on a day-to-day basis, handling the operational details while his commanding general, Dolman, dealt with the broader strategic and political dimensions of command. On the night of June 5th to 6th, 1944, Pemsel was the senior officer who was both awake and paying attention at 7th Army headquarters, and his actions in the crucial hours between midnight and dawn tell a story of professional competence in the face of confusion and institutional inertia. Born in Regensburg in 1897, Pemsel had served in the First World War and continued his career through the Weimar and Nazi periods, building a reputation as a skilled and methodical staff officer who could be trusted to manage complex operational situations. When the first reports of Allied paratroopers landing began to arrive at 7th Army headquarters in the early hours of June 6th, Pemsel was among the first to conclude that this was the real invasion rather than a diversion. His reasoning was based on both the scale of the reported airborne operation and on intelligence assessments that he had been tracking carefully. He immediately alerted General Dolman and began the process of standing up the Army's defensive response, issuing orders and coordinates, trying to cut through the confusion that was already beginning to paralyze the German command system. Crucially, Pemsel also alerted the Army Group B headquarters, Rommel's command, and pressed them to escalate the alert status and begin requesting authorization for the armoured reserves. His telephone logs from the night of June 5th to 6th have survived and provide an extraordinary minute-by-minute record of a professional staff officer doing everything in his power to organise an effective response while working within the constraints of a system that had built-in fatal delays and ambiguities. Pemsel's subsequent career after D-Day included continued service on the Western Front as the Normandy battle evolved. He survived the war and was taken prisoner. Unlike many of his colleagues, he did not face war crimes charges, and after his release from Allied custody, He became an important source for historians studying the German side of the Normandy campaign. He cooperated extensively with researchers and provided detailed testimony about the events of June 5th to 6th and the subsequent weeks of fighting. Max Pemsel died on June 30th, 1985, at the age of 87, having lived long enough to see the 40th anniversary commemorations of the campaign in which he had played his part. His careful professional response in the early hours of June 6th represents one of those moments when individual competence makes a difference even in the face of institutional failure, though in Pemsel's case the institutional failures outweighed his personal effectiveness, and the invasion succeeded despite his best efforts to mount a rapid and effective response. Of all the figures in the German chain of command on June 6, 1944, none casts a longer shadow over the question of what might have been than Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the victor of Tobruk, the man who had become the most famous German general in the world and one of the few Wehrmacht commanders whose reputation transcended mere military professionalism to achieve something approaching celebrity. Rommel was not in Normandy on D-Day. He was at home in Herlingen near Ulm in southern Germany, celebrating his wife Lucy Maria's birthday. He had departed Normandy on June 5th, driving to Germany in the belief that the weather conditions made an Allied invasion in the immediate future highly unlikely, and intending to see his wife on her birthday before travelling to Berchtesgaden to meet with Hitler and argue once again for more resources and clearer command authority over the armoured reserves. When the telephone rang at his home in the early hours of June 6th with news of the Allied landings, Rommel's reaction was to begin the long drive back to his La Roche-Guyon headquarters immediately. He arrived back at Army Group B that afternoon, by which time the Allies had secured their beachheads and the window for an immediate counterattack had closed. Erwin Rommel was born on November 15, 1891, in Heidenheim an der Brenz in the Kingdom of Württemberg. His father was a schoolteacher and his mother the daughter of a senior government official, a middle-class background that was in some ways atypical for senior German officers of his generation, many of whom came from the Prussian Junker nobility. Rommel entered the German army as an officer cadet in 1910 and distinguished himself almost immediately. In the First World War, he earned the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honour, for his extraordinary leadership at Caporetto in 1917, where his small unit captured more than 9,000 Italian prisoners in a single engagement through a combination of audacity, initiative, and tactical brilliance. He wrote a celebrated account of his infantry tactics from the First World War that became a standard text in military schools, and he entered the Second World War with a reputation as one of Germany's most innovative and aggressive tactical commanders. His command of the 7th Panzer Division in the French campaign of 1940 further cemented this reputation. The 7th Panzer Division, nicknamed the Ghost Division because it moved so fast that even German headquarters sometimes lost track of its position, advanced so rapidly through France that it seemed to materialize at unexpected places and times, unnerving French defenders and Allied planners alike. Rommel's drive across France demonstrated a mastery of armoured operations that brought him to the attention of the entire world, and when he was subsequently sent to North Africa in early 1941 to command the newly formed Deutsches Afrika Korps, he found the theatre that would make him a legend. His campaigns in Libya and Egypt, his capture of Tobruk, his dramatic advance toward Alexandria and the Suez Canal, and the elaborate cat-and-mouse battles of the Western Desert elevated him in the eyes of friend and foe alike to the status of a military genius. Even Churchill acknowledged his qualities in the House of Commons, a tribute that caused some political embarrassment but was a genuine reflection of the respect that Rommel's operational achievements commanded. The North Africa campaign ultimately ended in defeat at El Alamein in late 1942, and the subsequent Allied landings in Morocco and Algeria in November 1942 created a strategic encirclement that eventually forced the evacuation of Rommel himself, who was flown out of Africa before the final Axis surrender in Tunisia in May 1943. He commanded briefly in Italy after the Allied landings there, then was assigned to the Atlantic Wall inspection role that eventually evolved into his command of Army Group B in northern France. His task was to prepare the Normandy coastline for the Allied invasion that everyone knew was coming. The question was only where and when. Rommel threw himself into this task with characteristic energy, driving thousands of kilometres along the Atlantic Wall, inspecting fortifications, ordering improvements, personally supervising the emplacement of millions of beach obstacles, and arguing for a fundamental strategic change in how the German defense should be organized. He believed, correctly as events proved, that Allied air power would make it impossible to move armoured reserves to the coast in response to a landing, that the panzers would be destroyed in their assembly areas before they could reach the beach. His solution was to place the armoured divisions directly at the coast, where they could counterattack immediately within the first few hours of a landing, before the Allies could consolidate their bridgehead. This was the critical strategic dispute that defined the German command structure in Normandy, and that contributed significantly to the failure of the German defence on June 6th. The argument between Rommel and his superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, about where to place the armoured reserves is one of the most extensively analysed command controversies of the entire war. Rundstedt argued for keeping the panzers in a central reserve, positioned far enough back to avoid the initial Allied naval bombardment and air attacks, ready to strike the Allied beachhead with overwhelming concentrated force once it had been identified. He did not want to commit the armour piecemeal against multiple possible landing sites. Rommel argued that this strategy was fatally flawed, because Allied air power would prevent the centrally held reserves from reaching the coast in time to be decisive. The compromise that was reached, some armoured divisions placed near the coast under Army Group Command, others held in Central Reserve under OKW and therefore under Hitler's personal authority, satisfied neither general and arguably represented the worst of both worlds. On June 6, when the armoured counterattack was most urgently needed, the divisions under OKW control could not be released without Hitler's personal authorization, and Hitler, who slept late that morning and whose staff was reluctant to wake him with potentially premature news, did not authorize the release of the panzer reserves until the afternoon, by which time it was too late. Rommel spent the summer of 1944 fighting the impossible battle to contain the Allied beachhead, increasingly convinced that Germany could not win the war militarily and that a negotiated peace was the only alternative to total destruction. He was in contact with elements of the resistance movement within Germany, though the exact nature and extent of his involvement in the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt on Hitler has been debated by historians ever since. What is not in dispute is that Rommel was seriously wounded on July 17, 1944, when Allied aircraft attacked his staff car on a road in Normandy, leaving him with severe head injuries that took him out of the war. He was being treated at his home in Hellingen when the July 20th plot failed, and in the subsequent investigation, his name came up as someone who had at minimum known about the conspiracy without reporting it. In October 1944, two senior German officers visited Rommel at his home and gave him a choice. He could stand trial before the People's Court, where he would almost certainly be convicted and executed with consequences for his family, or he could take his own life with a cyanide capsule, in which case his death would be announced as the result of his wounds. He would receive a state funeral, and his family would be protected. Rommel chose death. On October 14, 1944, he took the cyanide and died. He was 52 years old. The German public was told that their most celebrated field marshal had died of his wounds. The truth emerged only after the war ended. Rommel's forced suicide is one of the darkest episodes in the history of Hitler's Germany, the regime consuming one of its own greatest heroes, silencing him before he could become a rallying point for resistance or a voice for negotiated peace. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the Commander-in-Chief West, who bore ultimate responsibility for the defence of Normandy, was 70 years old when the Allies landed. He had been born into a family with deep roots in the Prussian military tradition, commissioned as a young officer in 1892, and had served through the First World War and the Weimar period to become one of the most senior and respected commanders in the Wehrmacht. His relationship with the Nazi regime was complex and often uncomfortable. He was professionally loyal but personally contemptuous of many aspects of Nazism, and he had been dismissed and reinstated by Hitler multiple times in the course of the war, a pattern that reflected both his indispensability and the fundamental tension between professional military culture and the political requirements of the Third Reich. By June 1944, Rundstedt commanded all German forces in Western Europe from his headquarters at Saint-Germain-en-Laye near Paris. but his actual authority was severely circumscribed by the command arrangements that placed the armoured reserves under Hitler's personal control and that gave Rommel's Army Group B a degree of autonomy that created constant friction. On the morning of June 6th, Rundstedt acted more decisively than his subordinates in some respects. He ordered 2 panzer divisions, the 12th SS Panzer and the Panzer Lehr, to begin moving toward Normandy without waiting for Hitler's authorization. But his order was countermanded by OKW, and the divisions were halted. Rundstedt was furious. His reported comment to his staff that the order had made him look ridiculous and his characterization of the OKW interference as idiotic have become famous as expressions of the contempt that professional German officers felt for Hitler's micromanagement of the military machine. By early July, Rundstedt had had enough. When Field Marshal Heydte, the chief of OKW, telephoned him to ask what should be done, given the deteriorating situation in Normandy, Rundstedt gave his famous answer: "Make peace, you fools. What else can you do?" 2 days later, on July 3, 1944, Hitler relieved him of command and replaced him with Field Marshal Hans Günther von Kluge. Rundstedt's removal was the second time he had been dismissed from command during the war, the first having been in December 1941 on the Eastern Front. He would be recalled one more time in September 1944 before his final dismissal in March 1945. At the war's end, Rundstedt was captured by troops of the 36th Infantry Division of the American 7th Army on May 1, 1945. He was taken into custody as a potential war crimes defendant, and for several years after the war's end, he remained in Allied detention while the complex question of what charges to bring against him was debated. The British had particular interest in prosecuting him in connection with the Commando Order of 1942, which had mandated the summary execution of Allied commandos and Special Forces troops, even if they were in uniform, and had surrendered. There were also questions about his role in the atrocities committed during the invasion of the Soviet Union and about the Ardeatine Caves massacre in Italy. However, Rundstedt's age and deteriorating health, combined with the exhaustion of the post-war trial process and the political considerations that were already shifting attention from war crimes prosecution to the beginnings of the Cold War alliance between West Germany and the Western powers, ultimately meant that he was never brought to trial. He was released from custody in July 1948. He spent the remaining years of his life in Hanover and later in Bad Tölz in southern Germany. A respected, if controversial figure, some saw him as a consummate professional soldier who had done his duty within a system he could not control. Others viewed him as complicit in the crimes of that system through his willing participation in its wars of conquest. Gerd von Rundstedt died on February 24, 1953, in Hanover, at the age of 77. He had lived to see Germany divided, occupied and beginning its painful process of reconstruction, but had never been compelled to answer formally for his part in the events that had brought about that destruction. Would Germany's fate have been different if the armoured reserves had been committed without hesitation in the first hours of June 6th? It is one of history's great counterfactuals. The commanders who argued, pleaded and manoeuvred for those reserves on the morning of D-Day knew the answer, or thought they did. None of them got what they wanted in time, and among the consequences of that failure, one of the most immediate was the loss of the Normandy battle before it had fairly begun. But while the high commanders argued and waited for authorization, the men on the ground were fighting desperately to hold back the Allied tide. One of those men, one of the most dramatically unlucky German officers of the entire war, was General Wilhelm Falley. Wilhelm Falley was born on September 5, 1897, in Metz, at that time part of the German Empire following the Franco-Prussian War's annexation of Alsace-Lorraine. He pursued a military career through both world wars, rising through the ranks of the German army with the steady competence that characterized the professional Reichswehr and its Wehrmacht successor. By June 1944, he had reached the rank of General Lieutenant, the equivalent of a lieutenant general, and commanded the 91st Infantry Division, an air landing division that had been deployed to the Cotentin Peninsula in northern Normandy to reinforce the coastal defences and to provide a mobile reserve capable of responding to Allied airborne landings. The 91st Division had been specifically positioned in the Cotentin because German intelligence had correctly identified the area around Sainte-Mère-Église and the Meurdere River Valley as a likely Allied paratroop landing zone. Falley was, in other words, exactly the right man in exactly the right place to confront the American airborne operation that formed the western flank of the D-Day invasion. On the night of June 5th to 6th, Falley was not at his divisional headquarters. He had driven to Rennes to attend the command exercise and war game that General Dolman had ordered, the same exercise that had drawn so many other German commanders away from their posts on what would prove to be the worst possible night for them to be absent. When Allied paratroopers began landing in his division's sector in the early hours of June 6th, Falley received word and immediately turned his car around, racing back toward the Cotentin Peninsula through the dark, trying to reach his command and organize a response. He never made it. As his car approached his headquarters near the small village of Picauville, it was ambushed by American paratroopers. The men who ambushed him were soldiers of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the 82nd Airborne Division, themselves scattered and disoriented from a chaotic jump that had deposited American paratroopers across a wide swath of the Cotentin Peninsula. They were looking for German opposition wherever they could find it, and they found it in Falley's staff car. In the firefight that followed, Wilhelm Falley was shot and killed. He was 46 years old. The death of General Falley in the first hours of the Normandy campaign makes him the first German general officer to be killed on D-Day, and the circumstances of his death encapsulate something essential about the chaos and confusion of those early hours. An American paratrooper, probably not aware of the rank of the officer he had killed, had eliminated the commander of the division most directly responsible for counterattacking. The very airborne operation that the ambush party was part of. It was war in its most concentrated, randomized, terrible form. A general and a private in the darkness of a Norman road, neither fully understanding where he was or what was happening around him, and the outcome determined by a few seconds of violent chance. No post-war tribunal awaited Falley, no reckoning with the crimes of the regime he had served. His fate was decided in the Norman darkness on the morning that changed the world. Colonel Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heydte was one of those German officers whose biography contains enough contradictions and complexities to fill several books. Born on March 30th, 1907, into the Bavarian Catholic nobility, the Freiherr designation indicated his family's status as an untitled but recognized noble family. He combined a distinguished military career with genuine intellectual credentials that set him apart from the majority of his military contemporaries. He held a doctorate in law and had studied at a number of European universities, including time spent in England, which gave him an understanding of British culture and military thinking that was relatively rare among German officers. He was a devout Catholic in a regime that was at best indifferent and at worst hostile to the Church, a fact that created a permanent tension between his personal beliefs and his professional service. He was also, by the standards of the Wehrmacht, an unusually humane commander who made genuine efforts to treat prisoners of war and civilians according to the laws of war. Efforts that were not always easy to maintain given the pressures and precedents of the way the war was being conducted. Von der Heydte commanded the 6th Parachute Regiment, an elite unit that formed part of the 2nd Parachute Corps deployed in Normandy. His regiment was positioned in the area around Carentan on the Cotentin Peninsula, a location that would make it one of the most heavily engaged units in the entire D-Day battle. On the morning of June 6th, his paratroopers found themselves fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, engaging American paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division who had landed around Sainte-Mère-Église and Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, while also preparing to resist the American seaborne landing at Utah Beach that his regiment's sector overlooked. The fighting around Carentan in the days and weeks following D-Day was extraordinarily bitter. Von der Heydte's men held the town of Carentan itself against repeated American attacks, understanding that if Carentan fell, the American forces from Utah and Omaha beaches would be able to link up and create a continuous lodgment that would be virtually impossible to dislodge. The town fell to the Americans on June 12, 1944, after fighting that tested both sides to their limits. Von der Heydte survived the Normandy campaign and went on to command the ill-fated German parachute operation during the Ardennes. Offensive in December 1944, Operation Stösser, in which approximately 800 German paratroopers were dropped behind American lines to disrupt communications and create chaos. The operation was a disaster from the outset. The paratroopers were scattered across a wide area by poor navigation and bad weather, failed to achieve any of their objectives, and von der Heydte himself was captured by American forces on December 23, 1944, in the town of Marshal, where he turned himself in after wandering the frozen Ardennes for days, suffering from frostbite and exhaustion. He was imprisoned in the United States for a time before being returned to Germany at the end of the war. Unlike some of his colleagues, von der Heydte was not charged with war crimes. His record as a commander was, by the standards of the Wehrmacht, relatively clean. He was released and returned to West Germany, where he had a remarkable second career as an academic and politician. He taught international law at the University of Würzburg and the University of Munich, served as a member of the Bavarian State Parliament, and wrote extensively on military history and international law. He died on July 7, 1994, at the age of 87, one of the longest-lived of the senior German commanders who had fought on D-Day. His career arc, from elite military commander to democratic politician to legal scholar, represents one of the more successful examples of post-war reinvention among the officers who had served the Third Reich. The 352nd Infantry Division, which had so surprised the Americans landing on Omaha Beach with its unexpected presence, was commanded by General Lieutenant Dietrich Kreis, and understanding Kreis's situation on June 6th is essential to understanding why Omaha Beach became the bloodiest of the 5 D-Day landing zones. Kreis was born on October 16, 1898 in Heilbronn in the Kingdom of Württemberg, and like so many of his generation, his entire adult life had been shaped by military service. He had served in the First World War as a very young officer, continued through the interwar period, and commanded the 168th Infantry Division on the Eastern Front, before being given command of the 352nd. The 352nd was what Germans called a Bodenständiger Division, roughly translated as a static or position division. But it was more capable than the term might suggest. It had a cadre of experienced combat veterans from the Eastern Front, and when it was deployed to the Normandy sector in March 1944, it brought with it a level of combat experience and discipline that the pure coastal defense units it replaced entirely lacked. Kreis placed his division with considerable tactical skill. Rather than spreading his forces uniformly along the beach, he organized his defense in depth, with outposts on the beach itself backed by stronger positions on the bluffs overlooking the landing zone, with artillery placed further inland to bring fire down on the beach, from positions that would be difficult for naval gunfire to suppress. The result was that when the American 1st Infantry Division and elements of the 29th Infantry Division landed on Omaha Beach on the morning of June 6th, they ran into fire that was significantly more intense than anything that Allied planning had anticipated for that sector. The casualties on Omaha Beach were catastrophic. Approximately 2,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or went missing in the first hours of the landing, a rate of loss that at several points threatened to cause the entire operation to collapse. The famous image of the tidal flat, strewn with American dead and wounded, the men who had survived the crossing only to be cut down as they tried to wade ashore or take cover among the beach obstacles, was the direct result of Kreis's defensive dispositions. But Kreis was not simply a man who had organized an effective defense. His division's presence in the 352nd sector had not been known to Allied intelligence until almost the last moment, and even then the information had not been effectively disseminated to the soldiers who were about to land. There were also questions about the treatment of prisoners and civilians in the sector under Kreis's command, though these were generally less severe than the atrocities associated with SS formations further east. After the initial shock of the landing, as the Americans managed to fight their way up the bluffs at several points and begin to threaten the German positions, Kreis committed his reserves and counterattacked with considerable skill. For a time on the morning of June 6th, there was a genuine possibility that the Omaha landing would fail, that the Americans would be driven back into the sea or forced to withdraw. The extraordinary courage of American officers and men, particularly at the Draw E3 at Collierville and at Dog Green sector, where individual leadership made the difference between catastrophe and a tenuous foothold, was what ultimately turned the tide. By the end of June 6th, the Americans were ashore, and Kreis's defense, while it had inflicted terrible losses, had not achieved the decisive repulse that the German defensive doctrine required. Dietrich Kreis was killed in action on August 2, 1944, as the Allied breakout from Normandy was gathering momentum, shot during a reconnaissance near St. Lo. He was 45 years old, a divisional commander who had done his professional duty with considerable skill and had died in the performance of it before any post-war reckoning could reach him. The story of the 716th Infantry Division and its commander, General Lieutenant Wilhelm Richter, offers a striking contrast with the 352nd and Kreis. Where the 352nd was a relatively modern, experienced division with combat veterans from the Eastern Front, the 716th was a coastal defense division, a static unit composed largely of older men with disabilities that precluded service in mobile formations, and significant numbers of Eastern European soldiers of various nationalities who had been conscripted or had volunteered for service under various circumstances. The 716th held the beaches of Gold, Juno and Sword, the sectors where British and Canadian forces would land on June 6th, and its fighting capacity was considerably less than that of the 352nd to its right. Heydte was born on November 16, 1892, in Zeitz in Prussian Saxony, and had served through both world wars, building the kind of long, solid career that was typical of officers who reached divisional command through steady competence rather than exceptional brilliance. By June 1944, he was responsible for defending a 20-mile stretch of Norman coastline with resources that were simply inadequate to the task. When the British and Canadian forces landed on Gold, Juno and Sword beaches on the morning of June 6th, the 716th Division was overwhelmed relatively quickly in most sectors. There were individual, strong points and fortified positions that fought with considerable tenacity, and the German defenders in many of these positions died where they stood, rather than surrendering. But at the divisional level, Heydte's defence was fragmented and eventually unable to contain the Allied advance. By the afternoon of June 6th, British troops of the 3rd Infantry Division had pushed inland from Sword Beach to within a few miles of Caen, and Canadian forces had penetrated deeper into Normandy from Juno Beach than any other Allied formation that day. The failure to take Caen on the first day, a failure that would result in weeks of grinding, costly combat before the city finally fell in late July, was not due to the 716th Division's resistance, but to the intervention of 21st Panzer Division, which we will discuss shortly. Heydte survived the catastrophic defeat of his division on June 6th and continued to serve in various capacities as the Normandy battle evolved. His division was effectively destroyed in the fighting, and the remnants were absorbed into other formations. After the war, he was taken into Allied custody and questioned extensively about the events of June 6th and the subsequent campaign. He was not prosecuted for war crimes. The 716th Division's record, while it involved the implementation of occupation policies that caused civilian suffering, did not include the kinds of systematic mass atrocities that characterized SS and certain Wehrmacht formations elsewhere. Heydte was released and returned to civilian life in West Germany, dying in obscurity in 1971. His story is a relatively mundane one in the context of D-Day narratives, the commander of an outgunned and outmanned static division who did what he could with what he had and was swept aside by an overwhelming assault. How could the 21st Panzer Division have done more to prevent the Allied landings from securing their beachheads? This is the question that has haunted analysts of the D-Day battle ever since. And the answer involves not just the tactical decisions made by General Edgar Feuchtinger, the division's commander, but the entire confused German command structure that prevented a coordinated armoured response in the crucial hours when it might have made a decisive difference. The 21st Panzer Division was the only armoured formation positioned close enough to the Normandy beaches to intervene on June 6th, and its performance that day has been the subject of considerable controversy and historical debate ever since. But before examining the 21st Panzer's role, it is worth pausing to consider another officer whose story bridges the gap between the chaos of June 6th and the bitter attrition of the campaign that followed, Major Hans von Luck. Hans von Luck was born on July 15, 1911 in Flensburg, the son of an officer who had served in the Imperial German Navy, and he grew up in the tradition of professional military service that shaped his entire adult life. He joined the Reichswehr in 1929, and by the time the Second World War began, had already established himself as an officer of exceptional ability, serving in the 7th Panzer Division under Erwin Rommel during the French campaign of 1940. Von Luck and Rommel developed a close working relationship during the Western Campaign and subsequently in North Africa, where von Luck served in the 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion and later the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Regiment, becoming one of the most experienced panzer officers in the German army. His memoir, Panzer Commander, published after the war, became one of the most widely read first-hand accounts of armoured warfare from the German perspective. a book remarkable not only for its tactical detail, but for the reflective, often self-critical tone that distinguished it from the self-justifying memoirs produced by many of his contemporaries. By June 1944, von Luck was commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the 21st Panzer Division, Station 2, the east of Caen in the area between the Orne River and the Dives River. His regiment was one of the key mobile forces that could potentially intervene against the Allied landings, and on the morning of June 6th, as reports of Allied paratroopers landing to the north and east of Caen began to reach his command post, von Luck was immediately ready to respond. His troops were standing by, engines running, waiting for the order to move. The problem, the same problem that plagued every German armoured commander that morning, was that the order would not come for hours. General Feuchtinger, the divisional commander, was away from his headquarters. His whereabouts on the night of June 5th to 6th have been described variously as being at a social engagement in Paris and as making a personal inspection of forward positions, though the former explanation has always seemed more consistent with the subsequent timeline of events. When Feuchtinger finally returned and began to issue orders, the division's initial response was fragmented and poorly coordinated. Von Luck himself did not wait passively. According to his own account, he attempted to obtain authorization from higher command to begin moving his regiment north toward the British paratroopers who had landed around Ranville and the bridges over the Orne at Bénouville, what would become famous as Pegasus Bridge, the first objective seized by the Allied airborne assault. If he could retake those bridges and drive the British paratroopers back, he reasoned, he could deny the eastern flank of the invasion zone its protection and potentially threaten the entire British landing with a flanking attack. He reportedly telephoned divisional headquarters, corps headquarters, and army group headquarters seeking authorization. At each level, he was told to wait. When the order to attack finally came in the afternoon, the attack was directed not toward the bridges but toward the gap between the British beachhead at Sword Beach and the Canadian beachhead at Juno, a corridor through which Feuchtinger hoped to drive his armour to the coast and split the Allied landing force. The advance of the 21st Panzer Division toward the sea that afternoon was one of the most dramatic and ultimately most futile German counterattacks of D-Day. The leading elements of the division actually reached the coast briefly at Lyon-sur-Mer, becoming the first and essentially only German armoured force to penetrate to the beaches on June 6th. But they arrived too late in insufficient strength and at almost exactly the moment when the British 6th Airborne Division's glider reinforcements began landing in mass formations just to the north and east, an aerial spectacle that convinced the German tank commanders that they were about to be surrounded and caused them to withdraw. The opportunity, if it had ever truly existed, was gone. Von Luck spent the rest of the summer of 1944 in brutal defensive fighting in Normandy, then in the retreat through France, then in the desperate battles along the German border. He survived the war but was captured by Soviet forces in the chaos of the German collapse in the spring of 1945. What followed was one of the more harrowing post-war stories of any senior German officer to survive the conflict. Von Luck was sent to the Soviet Union as a prisoner of war and spent the next 5 years in Soviet captivity, enduring conditions that were far harsher than those experienced by German prisoners held by the Western Allies. He was held in various camps across the Soviet Union, subjected to interrogation, indoctrination attempts, and the grinding physical and psychological hardship that characterized Soviet treatment of German POWs. He was not released until 1950, 5 years after the war's end. When he finally returned to West Germany, he was 49 years old, with his best years consumed by war and captivity. He rebuilt his life with considerable determination, working in various commercial enterprises and eventually becoming a sought-after lecturer and public speaker on the history of the Normandy campaign. His memoir, written in the 1980s and published in 1989, became a classic of its genre. Hans von Luck died on August 1, 1997, in Hamburg at the age of 85. He had lived long enough to attend multiple D-Day anniversary commemorations in Normandy, where he was treated with respect and even warmth by former enemies who recognized in him the qualities that transcended the accidents of national allegiance: professional skill, personal honesty, and a genuine effort to reckon with the meaning of the war he had fought. The commander of the Armoured Reserve most immediately capable of influencing the D-Day battle, if properly directed, was not Feuchtinger or von Luck, but General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, who commanded Panzer Group West, the headquarters responsible for coordinating the employment of the armoured forces in the West. Von Schweppenberg was born on February 28, 1886 in Potsdam into the Prussian military aristocracy, and his career exemplified the trajectory of the traditional German officer class through the disasters of the 20th century. He had served as a military attaché in London before the war, giving him an understanding of the British military that was relatively rare among German generals, and he had developed sophisticated views on armoured warfare that placed him in broad agreement with Rommel's argument that the panzers needed to be deployed close to the coast rather than held in deep reserve. Despite this theoretical agreement with Rommel, von Schweppenberg found himself locked in a command authority dispute with Army Group B that made effective coordination between the two headquarters virtually impossible. On the evening of June 10th, just 4 days after D-Day, von Schweppenberg's headquarters at Lacaine, south of Caen, was struck by a devastating precision air attack by the Royal Air Force, which had obtained the location of the headquarters through the interception and decryption of Enigma communications at Bletchley Park, though this fact would not be publicly known for decades. The attack killed or wounded most of the key staff officers at Panzer Group West, destroyed communications equipment and vehicles, and effectively put the headquarters out of action for days. Von Schweppenberg himself was wounded and evacuated. The destruction of Panzer Group West headquarters on June 10th further disrupted the already chaotic German armoured response to the Normandy landings and delayed any possibility of a coordinated armoured counterattack by weeks. Von Schweppenberg was eventually replaced in command by General Hans Eberbach, who inherited an impossible situation and fought it with considerable skill. Von Schweppenberg himself survived the war, was taken prisoner by the Allies, and was not prosecuted for war crimes. He participated extensively in the post-war historical reconstruction of the Normandy campaign, providing detailed testimony to historians and participating in the studies conducted by the U.S. Army's Historical Division. He died on August 27, 1974, in Irschenhausen in Bavaria, at the age of 88, one of the longest-lived of the senior German commanders associated with the Normandy campaign. The defence of Cherbourg represents one of the most significant subplots of the Normandy campaign, and its central figure, General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, offers a story that encompasses both the doomed heroism of the German defence and the complex questions of how German officers navigated the demands of a regime that expected them to fight to the last bullet in the service of a cause that was already clearly lost. Schlieben was born on October 30th, 1894 in Eisenach, the Thuringian city most famous as the birthplace of Johann Sebastian Bach, and had built a long military career through both world wars. He commanded the 208th Infantry Division on the Eastern Front before being transferred to France, where by June 1944 he was commanding the 709th Infantry Division in the northern Cotentin Peninsula, the area immediately surrounding the port of Cherbourg. When the American 7th Corps under General J. Lawton Collins began its drive up the Cotentin Peninsula following the D-Day landings, with the explicit goal of capturing Cherbourg and its deep-water port facilities, Schlieben found himself commanding the defence of an increasingly isolated fortress. Hitler, as was his invariable practice in such situations, declared Cherbourg a Festung, a fortress, and ordered it held to the last. Schlieben received reinforcements in the form of troops who had been cut off from the main German line by the American advance and who fell back into the Cherbourg perimeter. But these additions were offset by the steady attrition of the American assault and the inability of the Luftwaffe to provide the air support that might have helped sustain the defence. The American assault on Cherbourg began in earnest on June 22nd, and despite Schlieben's orders to fight to the last, the defence began to crumble under the weight of American artillery, air support, and infantry assault. On June 26, 1944, Schlieben was captured in the tunnels of his command bunker beneath the city of Cherbourg, personally taken prisoner by American soldiers. He had not managed to destroy the port facilities as thoroughly as German orders required, though German engineers had done significant damage to the docks and harbour that would take months for Allied engineers to repair. His capture with the port still partially intact was regarded by the German command as a failure, and there were official expressions of disapproval about the timing and manner of his surrender. In American captivity, Schlieben was treated relatively well and was interviewed extensively about German defensive dispositions, command arrangements, and morale. He was one of the more cooperative German generals in terms of providing information to Allied intelligence services, though this cooperation was as much a function of the realities of his situation. He was a prisoner. His cause was defeated, as of any particular ideological conversion. After the war ended, Schlieffen was held for several years as a potential war crimes defendant, with attention focused on his command on the Eastern Front and the treatment of civilians in his operational area. However, he was not ultimately brought to trial. The combination of his relatively junior status compared to the major war crimes defendants, the lack of specific evidence linking him to particular atrocities, and the general winding down of the war crimes prosecution process in the late 1940s and early 1950s all contributed to his eventual release. Karl Wilhelm von Schlieffen died on June 18, 1964, in Gießen, West Germany, at the age of 69, a figure largely forgotten by history, his name remembered primarily in connection with the fall of Cherbourg. General Hans Speidel occupied one of the most complicated positions in the entire German military hierarchy during the Normandy campaign. As Rommel's chief of staff at Army Group B, Speidel was the essential link between the field marshal and the operational staff that translated his decisions into orders, coordinated the response to the Allied landings, and maintained the administrative machinery of the command. But Speidel was also something that very few men in senior Wehrmacht positions dared to be: an active participant in the resistance against Hitler. Born on October 28, 1897, in Metzingen in the Kingdom of Württemberg, Speidel combined a distinguished military career with genuine intellectual credentials. He held a doctorate in history and philosophy and had published scholarly work before the war. He spoke French fluently, which made him particularly suited for service in occupied France, and he had wide social and political connections that extended well beyond the narrow world of the German officer corps. Speidel was deeply involved in the conspiracy that produced the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt on Hitler. He served as a critical conduit between Rommel and the broader conspiracy network, helping to ensure that the Field Marshal understood the nature and scope of what was being planned, and working to bring his enormous prestige and popularity behind the effort to overthrow the Nazi regime and negotiate a peace. When the July 20th plot failed and the subsequent Gestapo investigation began to close in on those involved, Speidel was arrested on September 7, 1944. His position was extremely precarious. Many of those implicated in the conspiracy were executed with extraordinary brutality, hanged with piano wire from meat hooks in a process that was filmed and reportedly shown to Hitler. Speidel's survival in custody, when so many others were killed, was the result of a combination of factors: his skill in managing his interrogations, the intervention of senior military officers who provided character testimony on his behalf, and a degree of calculated ambiguity in the evidence against him that made it difficult to establish his culpability beyond doubt. He was held by the Gestapo, but never brought to trial, and he was liberated by French forces in April 1945, before the German collapse could result in his execution. The post-war career of Hans Speidel is one of the most extraordinary examples of successful reinvention in the history of the German officer class. Rather than facing prosecution as a war criminal, he had, after all, served at a senior level in the German military machine that had committed enormous crimes. He was rehabilitated through his association with the resistance movement and through the political requirements of the early Cold War period. West Germany, under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, was being integrated into the Western Alliance, and the creation of the Bundeswehr, the new West German army, required senior officers with military experience. Speidel, with his combination of professional military competence and his resistance credentials, was exactly the kind of figure that the new democratic German military establishment needed. He became one of the founding officers of the Bundeswehr and rose to the rank of general, eventually serving as Commander-in-Chief of NATO's Allied Land Forces Central Europe from 1957 to 1963. He was the first German officer to hold a NATO command in the post-war period, a remarkable transformation from the man who had been held by the Gestapo just over a decade earlier. Hans Speidel died on November 28, 1984, in Bad Honnef at the age of 87. His life described an arc that few could have predicted in the dark days of 1944, from Rommel's conspirator chief of staff to NATO commander, a trajectory that embodied both the genuine complexity of German resistance to Nazism and the sometimes uncomfortable speed with which the Cold War transformed former enemies into allies. The SS formations that fought in Normandy represent perhaps the most morally charged chapter of the entire D-Day story. The Waffen-SS, the armed component of Heinrich Himmler's SS organization, had a record in occupied Europe that was saturated with war crimes, massacres, and systematic brutality. The SS divisions deployed in France in June 1944 were among the most experienced and capable formations in the German order of battle, but they were also formations whose histories were inextricably linked with the worst crimes of the Third Reich. When the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth Division composed of teenagers fanatical in their dedication to the Nazi cause, was committed to the fighting around Caen in the days following D-Day, it fought with a ferocity and tactical skill that earned the grudging respect of Canadian forces who bore the brunt of its counterattacks. It also committed within days of the D-Day landings some of the worst atrocities of the Normandy campaign, murdering more than 100 Canadian prisoners of war in the days immediately following June 6th. The commander most directly associated with the SS formations in Normandy was SS Oberstgruppenführer Josef Sepp Bittrich, who commanded the 1st SS Panzer Corps and was one of the most colourful, brutal and complicated figures in the entire history of the Waffen-SS. Bittrich was born on May 28, 1892, in Hawangen in Bavaria, the son of a master butcher, and his background was entirely working class, a fact that distinguished him sharply from the aristocratic officers who dominated much of the regular Wehrmacht command structure. He had served in the First World War, winning the Iron Cross First and Second Class and participating in some of the most brutal fighting on the Western Front, and had become an early and dedicated follower of Adolf Hitler, joining the NSDAP in 1928 and serving as Hitler's personal bodyguard before commanding various SS formations as the organization expanded into a significant military force. Bittrich's military record during the Second World War was a mixture of genuine tactical ability and consistent association with atrocities. His command in France in 1940, in Greece in 1941, and on the Eastern Front through 1942 and 1943 had produced both military successes and incidents that violated the laws of war. He had little formal military education and relied heavily on his professional staff officers, but he had an instinctive grasp of tactical situations and a personal courage that was genuine and that earned him the loyalty of his men. By June 1944, commanding the 1st SS Panzer Corps in Normandy, he was responsible for directing the armoured counterattacks that attempted to contain the Allied beachhead around Caen. The fighting under his corps command included the actions of the 12th SS Panzer Division, in which the Canadian prisoners were murdered, crimes for which Bittrich was eventually held to bear command responsibility. After the Normandy campaign, Bittrich commanded the 6th SS Panzer Army during the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the last major German offensive in the West. His army's advance was characterized by both tactical failure, the breakthrough he was supposed to achieve was stopped by American resistance, and the inadequacy of German fuel supplies, and by the infamous Malmedy massacre of December 17, 1944, in which soldiers of the SS Leibstandarte Division under his command murdered approximately 84 American prisoners of war near Malmedy, Belgium. This atrocity, perhaps the most publicized German war crime against American forces in the entire war, would define Bittrich's post-war legal fate. After Germany's surrender, Bittrich was arrested by American forces and tried as part of the Malmedy massacre proceedings. In July 1946, he was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. However, in a pattern that became depressingly familiar in the post-war decade, his sentence was progressively reduced under American review processes influenced by Cold War political considerations, representations from various German veterans organizations, and campaigns by figures who argued, not entirely without basis, that the American military courts had not always conducted their proceedings with perfect fairness. His sentence was reduced to 25 years in 1951, and he was released in October 1955, having served less than a decade. He was subsequently tried by a West German court for his role in the murders of SA leaders during the Night of the Long Knives in 1934 and sentenced to an additional 18 months, which he served. Josef Sepp Bittrich died on April 21, 1966, in Ludwigsburg at the age of 73. His death was attended by some controversy. a large crowd of former SS veterans gathered for his funeral, a display of unreconstructed sentiment that shocked many observers and demonstrated that the process of denazification had been considerably less thorough than official narratives like to claim. The armoured force that theoretically should have been committed on D-Day itself, the SS division that was closest to the beaches on the morning of June 6th, was the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, though in practice its commitment was delayed for the same reasons that delayed all the German armoured reserves. The requirement for Hitler's personal authorization and the confused command structure that prevented anyone from acting with the decisive speed the situation required. The longer-term story of how the SS Panzer formations fought, killed, and were ultimately defeated in Normandy is inseparable from the question of what justice looked like for the men who commanded them. One of the more intellectually interesting SS commanders associated with the Normandy campaign was SS Obergruppenführer Wilhelm Bittrich, who commanded the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. Born on February 26, 1894, in Wernigerode in the Harz Mountains, Bittrich had served in the Imperial German Army's Aviation Corps during the First World War and had become a Freikorps fighter in the turbulent post-war years before eventually joining the SS in 1934. His military reputation was built primarily on the Eastern Front, where he commanded various SS formations with a combination of tactical skill and the ruthlessness that characterized Waffen-SS operations in the Soviet Union. By June 1944, his 2nd SS Panzer Corps was stationed in the area around Toulouse in southern France, theoretically available as a reserve to be committed wherever the decisive Allied thrust developed. Bittrich's corps became famous, or notorious depending on one's perspective, for its role in the Battle of Arnhem in September 1944, when it destroyed the British 1st Airborne Division that had landed near the bridge at Arnhem as part of Operation Market Garden. His decision to commit his 2 corps divisions, the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, against the British paratroopers with remarkable speed and tactical effectiveness was the primary reason that the Arnhem Bridge was never securely held by Allied forces and that Operation Market Garden ultimately failed to achieve its objectives. This was undoubtedly a significant military achievement from the German perspective, but it was achieved by formations whose record elsewhere included massacres of civilians and the murder of prisoners. Bittrich survived the war and was captured by the French, who were particularly interested in his command's activities in occupied France. He was held in French custody for several years and was tried by a French military tribunal in connection with atrocities committed in France, for which he was sentenced to imprisonment. He was released in 1953 after serving several years of his sentence. Unlike some of his SS colleagues, Bittrich maintained a relatively low profile in post-war West Germany and did not become publicly associated with the veterans' organizations and quasi-political movements that clustered around former SS figures. He died on April 19, 1979, in Wolfratshausen in Bavaria, at the age of 85. On the western flank of the D-Day battlefield at Utah Beach, the American landing achieved its objectives with far fewer casualties than Omaha, partly because of fortunate navigation errors that brought the first landing craft ashore on a stretch of beach that was less well defended than the intended landing zone, and partly because the defending formations were in poorer condition and more rapidly overwhelmed than those facing the Omaha assault. But the German defenders of the coastal fortifications and the beach bunkers on the Utah sector fought with determined tenacity in many cases, and none more so than the crew of the strongpoint at Les Dunes de Varaville, defended by soldiers of the 709th Infantry Division under a young lieutenant named Arthur Janke. Arthur Janke was born in 1921, making him one of the youngest German officers to command a significant defensive position on D-Day. He had served on the Eastern Front, where he had been seriously wounded and had lost 2 fingers on his right hand, earning the Knight's Cross for actions during the fighting around Stalingrad. His transfer to France was partly the result of his wounds, and partly the routine rotation of officers between different theatres that the German army practiced throughout the war. He was assigned to command strongpoint WN5 at Les Dunes de Varaville, a beach defensive position on the Utah Beach sector that consisted of several concrete bunkers, artillery pieces, machine gun positions, and anti-tank obstacles. Janke was a professional soldier who had seen enough of the Eastern Front to understand what serious fighting looked like, and he prepared his position with the thoroughness of a man who took the Allied invasion threat seriously, even when many of his superiors seemed less concerned. The attack on Janki's position on the morning of June 6th was preceded by an aerial bombardment that, unlike the bombing of the Omaha sector, where accuracy had been poor, struck relatively close to its intended targets and significantly damaged some of Janki's defences. Then came the naval bombardment, which further battered the fortifications and knocked out several of his weapons. By the time the first American landing craft began grinding ashore on his stretch of beach, Janki's garrison had been substantially weakened even before the first infantryman stepped onto the sand. He and his men fought with considerable courage and determination, attempting to engage the landing craft and the troops wading ashore with the weapons that remained operational, but they were rapidly overwhelmed by the weight of the American assault. Janki himself was captured by American forces on the beach and spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner of war. His experience was made famous decades later when Cornelius Ryan interviewed him extensively for The Longest Day, and his account of the morning of June 6th, the bombardment, the impossible odds, the realization that the American assault was something that no amount of determination could stop, became one of the most vivid German testimonies in Ryan's book. After the war, Janki returned to Germany and pursued a civilian career, living to see his story told in the film adaptation of The Longest Day, in which he was portrayed on screen. His was the story of an ordinary professional soldier caught up in an extraordinary event who did his duty without extraordinary crimes and survived to tell the tale. The parachute forces of the German army, the Fallschirmjäger, played a significant role in the Normandy defence, and their commander in the sector, General Eugen Meindl, who commanded the 2nd Parachute Corps, was one of the most capable German commanders of the entire Normandy campaign. Born on July 16, 1892, in Donaueschingen in the Black Forest, Meindl had served in the First World War and had become an early convert to the concept of airborne warfare, transferring to the nascent German parachute forces in the 1930s and helping to build them into one of the most formidable elite formations in the German order of battle. He had commanded paratroopers in the assault on Crete in May 1941, one of the most dramatic airborne operations in military history, and had been seriously wounded during the fighting, but had returned to command with the same resilience that characterized the best German officers of his generation. Meindl's 2nd Parachute Corps, which included von der Heydte's 6th Parachute Regiment among its component formations, was deployed in the area around St. Lo in the weeks following D-Day, and it was in this sector that some of the most bitter fighting of the Normandy campaign took place. The city of St. Lo itself became a symbol of the grinding hedgerow fighting that characterized the American advance through the Bocage country of Normandy, difficult terrain of small fields separated by dense earthen banks topped with hedgerows, ideal for the defense and miserable for the attacker. Meindl organized his parachute forces for this kind of fighting with considerable skill, exploiting the bocage terrain to create defensive positions that imposed severe casualties on the advancing Americans. The American 19th Corps, fighting its way towards St. Lo through July 1944, found Meindl's paratroopers among the toughest opponents it encountered in the entire campaign. The city finally fell to the Americans on July 18, 1944, at enormous cost to both sides in fighting that left St. Lo so thoroughly destroyed that a French newspaper of the time described it as the capital of ruins. Meindl was eventually pushed back with the rest of the German forces during the breakout from Normandy, and he continued to command his corps through the subsequent fighting in France and then in Germany itself. He survived the war and was taken prisoner by Allied forces. He was not prosecuted for war crimes and was released from captivity in the years following the armistice. Eugen Meindl died on January 24, 1964, in Munich, at the age of 71. The story of General Paul Hausser and the SS Panzer formations in Normandy encapsulates in a single career the terrible moral contradictions of German military service during the Second World War. Hausser was born on October 7, 1880, in Brandenburg an der Havel, making him 63 years old when D-Day occurred, considerably older than most of the other divisional and corps commanders involved in the Normandy battle. He had served with great distinction in the Imperial German Army during the First World War, rising to the rank of lieutenant general before retiring from the Reichswehr in 1932. He then made the decision that would define his historical reputation. He joined the SS in 1934, becoming one of the senior military figures who gave the nascent Waffen-SS its professional military credibility and helped transform it from Hitler's bodyguard organization into what would become, by 1944, one of the largest and most powerful military formations in the German order of battle. Hausser has been described by some historians as the father of the Waffen-SS as a military organization, a judgment that, given the organization's record of atrocities, carries a weight of historical condemnation alongside any military acknowledgement. By June 1944, Hausser commanded the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which included the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions. He was not in the immediate Normandy sector on D-Day, his corps was further south in France, but he became deeply involved in the Normandy battle within weeks of the landings, as his corps was committed to the fighting around Caen. In late July 1944, he took command of the 7th Army following the death of General Dolman, becoming the first SS general to command a German field army. This promotion reflected both the devastating losses that the Wehrmacht had suffered among its senior commanders and the growing influence of the SS within the German military hierarchy, as the Wehrmacht itself was ground down by continuous combat. His command of the 7th Army during the Falley's Pocket, the catastrophic encirclement of German forces in Normandy by Allied forces in August 1944, was a testament to desperate improvisation under impossible circumstances. When the Falley's Pocket closed in mid-August 1944, trapping approximately 100,000 German soldiers, Hausser personally led the breakout attempt, himself seriously wounded in the fighting, losing an eye but managing to escape with a substantial portion of the surrounded force. After the war, Hausser was tried by American military courts in connection with his command role during the Normandy massacre proceedings, being held to bear command responsibility for atrocities committed by formations under his overall command. He was sentenced to imprisonment, but like Sepp Dietrich, he benefited from the commutation process of the late 1940s and early 1950s, and was released in 1954. He subsequently became one of the most active and influential figures in the organization known as HIAG, the Mutual Aid Association of former Waffen-SS members, which worked to rehabilitate the reputation of the Waffen-SS and to secure pensions and benefits for its veterans. This activity, which involved arguing strenuously that the Waffen-SS had been a purely military organization equivalent to regular army formations, and that its members should not be held responsible for the broader crimes of the SS, was deeply controversial and was opposed by many historians and public figures who argued that the distinction between the Waffen-SS and the broader SS organization was largely artificial. Hausser published memoirs and historical studies through HIAG's publishing channels that presented the most favorable possible interpretation of Waffen-SS military service. He died on December 21, 1972 in Ludwigsburg at the age of 92, one of the oldest and most controversial of all the German commanders associated with the Second World War to survive into the post-war era. His long life meant that he witnessed not only the rebuilding of Germany as a democratic state, but also the gradual, painful process by which the full extent of SS crimes was documented and acknowledged, a process that challenged the comfortable narratives he had spent decades constructing. The defence of the beaches of Normandy was not conducted solely by German nationals. Among the more remarkable aspects of the D-Day story, often overlooked in the standard narratives, is the significant presence of non-German soldiers fighting in German uniforms on the beaches and in the fortifications. The German army in the West in 1944 included substantial numbers of Eastern European soldiers, Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, and soldiers from a dozen other nationalities who had ended up in German service through various combinations of voluntarism, coercion, and the complex calculations of men caught between multiple totalitarianisms. These were the Osttruppen, the Eastern troops, and by some estimates they comprised as much as 15 to 20% of the German forces in Normandy. Their loyalty to the German cause was, unsurprisingly, variable. When Allied forces landed and the fighting began, some Osttruppen fought with determination, others surrendered at the first opportunity, some even went further, switching sides and firing at their former German comrades. The German officer responsible for many of these formations in the Normandy sector was General Boris Holmsten-Smyslowski, but the broader story of the Osttruppen's role in the D-Day battle remains one of the least explored aspects of the entire campaign. Another figure whose D-Day story deserves recognition is Colonel General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who commanded the overall anti-aircraft defence of the Normandy coast, though his story is perhaps better known for events that preceded and followed June 6th. More directly relevant to the immediate tactical story of the beaches is the figure of Major Werner Pluscat's direct superior, the commander of the 352nd Artillery Regiment, Oberst Ernst Goth, who coordinated the artillery fire that caused such devastating casualties among the American landing forces at Omaha Beach. Goth was a professional artilleryman of considerable skill whose organization of the pre-registered fire plans for the Omaha sector created the framework within which Pluscat and the other battery commanders operated. He survived D-Day and continued to command the 352nd Artillery through the subsequent Normandy fighting. His post-war fate was relatively undramatic. He was captured, held briefly, and released without facing war crimes charges, the kind of outcome that was typical for officers whose wartime service had been professional rather than criminal. The story of what happened in the German command centers as the D-Day battle unfolded has a kind of terrible inevitability when viewed from the distance of 8 decades. The decisions made, or not made, in the crucial hours of June 6th shaped not just the outcome of the Normandy campaign but the entire subsequent history of the war and of the world. The failure to commit the panzer reserves in the first hours, the confusion about whether the Normandy landings were the real invasion or a feint, the absence of key commanders from their posts, the overarching paralysis imposed by the requirement for Hitler's personal authorization before any significant mobile reserve could be moved, these were not accidents or anomalies. They were the logical product of the command system that Hitler had built, a system designed to prevent any concentration of military power that might threaten his own position, even at the cost of operational effectiveness in the field. The German military machine that faced the Allied invasion in June 1944 was, in many respects, crippled by the very political arrangements that had created and sustained it. What became of the men who had staffed the German command bunkers and command posts on the night of June 5th to 6th? The military operators who sat at the switchboards of the German telecommunications network in Normandy that night, routing calls between desperate commanders and indifferent superiors, had their own stories. One of the most poignant of these belongs to the telephone operators of the 84th Corps headquarters in St. Lo, who remained at their posts through the Allied bombing of the city and the subsequent American assault, routing communications until the last possible moment, before the headquarters was overrun or forced to relocate. Their names are mostly unknown to history, the anonymous infrastructure of command without which no general's plan can be executed. But let us return to one more senior figure whose story encapsulates the contradictions of the German command in Normandy with particular clarity. General Heinrich Eberbach, who took command of Panzer Group West after Leo Geyer von Schweppenburg was wounded in the June 10th air attack, was one of those German officers who combined professional military excellence with a record of command over formations that committed atrocities. Born on November 24, 1895 in Stuttgart, Eberbach had served in the First World War and had built his career through the interwar period, commanding panzer formations with considerable skill in France, the Soviet Union, and eventually in Normandy. When he took over Panzer Group West in mid-June 1944, he inherited not just a shattered headquarters but an increasingly impossible operational situation. The Allied beachhead was expanding, the German armoured forces were being ground down in defensive fighting around Caen without achieving the breakthrough that would allow them to operate offensively. And the supply situation was deteriorating as Allied air power attacked German logistics throughout the depth of the theatre. Eberbach's handling of the armoured battle around Caen during late June and July 1944 was professionally competent given the constraints under which he operated, but the constraints were too severe to allow any fundamentally different outcome. The German armour was superior in many individual respects. The Tiger and Panther tanks outgunned most Allied armoured vehicles in direct engagements. But Allied air power, artillery superiority, and the inexhaustible supply of replacements available to the Allies through the expanding beachhead meant that every German tactical success was immediately nullified at the operational level. By the time the Allied breakout began at the end of July 1944 with Operation Cobra, the German armoured force in Normandy had been so attenuated that it could not mount the kind of counterattack that might have threatened the American columns driving south. Eberbach himself was captured by British forces on August 31, 1944, during the chaos of the German retreat from France. He was held as a prisoner of war and was, like many German generals, questioned extensively. After the war, he was released without being charged and returned to West Germany, where he died on July 13, 1992, at the age of 96. His longevity was extraordinary. A panzer general of the Second World War who lived to see the Berlin Wall fall and German reunification. The story of the German defence of Normandy cannot be told without acknowledging the role played by intelligence, or the catastrophic failure of German intelligence in setting the conditions for the Allied success. The German intelligence system in the West in 1944 was fundamentally compromised by the Allies' successful penetration of the Enigma cipher system at Bletchley Park, though this would not be publicly known until the 1970s. German military communications were being read by Allied intelligence almost in real time, providing Allied planners with a window into German operational thinking that was invaluable in designing the D-Day plan and in managing the crucial deception operation known as Fortitude, which convinced the Germans that the main Allied landing would come at the Pas de Calais rather than in Normandy. The German officer most directly responsible for assessing Allied intentions in the West was the intelligence chief of OB West, the Western Command, Colonel Roger Michael, but the most significant figure in the intelligence failure that made D-Day possible was the man who ran the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. Wilhelm Canaris is one of the most enigmatic figures of the entire Second World War. Born on January 1, 1887, in Applerbeck near Dortmund, he had served as a naval officer in the First World War, participated in the confused political violence of the early Weimar period, and had risen to head the Abwehr by 1935. His relationship with the Nazi regime was always complicated and often contradictory. He served the regime loyally in many respects while simultaneously maintaining contacts with resistance figures, allowing certain anti-Nazi activities to proceed under the cover of intelligence operations, and apparently feeding inaccurate or misleading information to the regime in certain situations. Whether Canaris was a genuine resistor who was working systematically to undermine the Nazi state, a professional intelligence officer who had convinced himself he could serve two masters, or simply a man who navigated the contradictions of his position with insufficient commitment to either loyalty or resistance, has been debated by historians for decades without definitive resolution. What is certain is that the Abwehr under Canaris was a less effective instrument of intelligence than the regime deserved if it was to have any chance of successfully defending against the Allied invasion. The Abwehr's network of agents in Britain had been thoroughly penetrated by British intelligence. Most German agents in Britain had been captured, turned, and were operating under British control as part of the double-cross system that fed the Germans with the disinformation that supported Operation Fortitude. When German intelligence reported that the Pas de Calais was the intended main Allied landing site, it was reporting disinformation that had been carefully constructed and fed through turned agents. Canaris did not last long enough to see the full consequences of these failures. He had been dismissed from the head of the Abwehr in February 1944, just months before D-Day, as the regime became increasingly suspicious of his loyalty and competence. Following the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt on Hitler, the subsequent investigation revealed Canaris's contacts with the resistance movement, and he was arrested. He was held in increasingly harsh conditions, tortured and ultimately executed on April 9, 1945, in the Flossenbürg concentration camp just weeks before Germany's final surrender. He died knowing that the invasion whose intelligence preparation he had so comprehensively failed to counter had succeeded, that the Allied armies were driving deep into Germany from both east and west, and that the regime he had served, however ambivalently, was in its final days. Another figure whose story is inextricably linked with the intelligence failure that enabled D-Day is Generalleutnant Alexis von Roehner, the head of the intelligence section Fremde Heere West, Foreign Armies West, which was responsible for assessing Allied order of battle and intentions in the West. Von Roehner was born on May 8, 1905, in Sorchen in East Prussia, and had built a career as an intelligence analyst of considerable ability, developing a reputation for precise and careful assessments that were valued at the highest levels of the German military command. He was also, it would later emerge, a deeply committed opponent of the Nazi regime, who had connections to the resistance movement and who appears to have deliberately inflated Allied order of battle estimates in ways that contributed to the German belief that the Normandy landings were a feint, that the main Allied force was still waiting to strike at the Pas de Calais. By exaggerating the number of Allied divisions available in England, von Roehner helped create and sustain the German conviction that the forces landed in Normandy could not represent the full Allied commitment, that more powerful forces must still be waiting to exploit the real deception. This intelligence distortion was one of the most significant single factors in preventing Hitler from releasing the OKW reserve panzer divisions to counterattack in Normandy on June 6th. Von Renner was arrested following the July 20th plot investigation and was executed on October 12, 1944, at Plötzensee prison in Berlin, in the same brutal manner, hanging from a meat hook with piano wire, that claimed so many of those implicated in the conspiracy. He was 39 years old. Among the junior German officers who survived D-Day and whose later testimony contributed significantly to the historical record, Major Werner Pluscat stands as perhaps the most symbolically important. His position at the binoculars on the Norman cliffs, watching the Allied armada materialize out of the Channel mist, is the image that encapsulates the German experience of that morning better than any other. The moment of seeing what was coming and knowing with absolute certainty that nothing could stop it. But there were dozens of other junior and middle-ranking officers who survived the day, and who later contributed to the historical record in ways both deliberate and inadvertent. Hauptmann Helmut Liebeskind, who commanded a company in the 916th Grenadier Regiment of the 352nd Division, and who fought through the morning of June 6th against the American assault on Omaha Beach, gave one of the most detailed German accounts of the beach fighting. He described the almost surreal spectacle of the American landing craft coming in through the artillery fire and the machine gun fire, the bodies floating in the surf, the inexorable advance of the assault waves despite the terrible losses they were absorbing. He survived the Normandy campaign, and later provided testimony that historians used extensively in reconstructing the German experience at Omaha Beach. The pilots of the Luftwaffe who were supposed to contest Allied air superiority over the beaches on June 6th, and who largely failed to do so, represent another chapter of the D-Day story that is worth examining briefly. The third. Air Fleet, commanded by Field Marshal Hugo Speidel, had only around 100 serviceable fighters available in France on the morning of June 6th, compared to the approximately 12,000 Allied aircraft committed to the Normandy operation. This numerical disparity was so overwhelming that German pilots who did attempt to attack the Allied fleet were essentially on suicide missions. 2 German fighter pilots, literally only 2, made it over the beaches in the daylight hours of June 6th and strafed the landing zones. These were Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Priller, the commander of the 26th Fighter Wing and a celebrated ace with approximately 100 aerial victories to his credit, and his wingman Heinz Wodarczyk. Their lone strafing run over Sword Beach, coming in at low altitude in the face of massive Allied anti-aircraft fire, was an act of extraordinary individual courage, though it had precisely zero impact on the outcome of the battle. Priller was furious at his superiors who had dispersed his wing to airfields further from the coast in response to Allied pre-invasion bombing, and had therefore made it impossible to mount any meaningful Luftwaffe response to the landings. His complaints to his divisional headquarters on the morning of June 6th, reconstructed from his subsequent testimony and dramatised memorably in The Longest Day film, in which he was portrayed by Robert Wagner, were a classic expression of the impotence that characterised the German response to the invasion at every level. Priller survived the war, having accumulated over 100 aerial victories, and died on May 20th, 1961, in Böblingen, West Germany. He was 45 years old, killed in a car accident rather than in combat, a fate that seems almost too symbolic, given the way he had survived so much greater danger. As the summer of 1944 wore on and the Allied breakout from Normandy became a reality, as the great armoured columns of Patton's Third Army swept south, and then east in a manoeuvre that threatened to encircle the entire German force in northern France, the German officers who had been part of the D-Day defence faced a reckoning that was partly military and partly historical. The Falaise Pocket in August 1944, in which approximately 50,000 German soldiers were killed and another 50,000 captured, was the final catastrophe of the Normandy campaign. The roads through the Falaise Gap were clogged with burning vehicles, dead horses, and the detritus of a destroyed army. Allied aircraft swept back and forth over the fleeing columns, transforming the routes of retreat into what Allied ground forces, who had to advance through the aftermath, described as a vast charnel house. The officers who survived this ordeal, men like Hans Eberbach, who was captured, and others who managed to escape through the gap before it closed, carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in one of the greatest military defeats in German history. What conclusions can we draw from the stories of all these men, From Werner Pluscat at his binoculars on the cliffs above Omaha Beach, to Rommel celebrating his wife's birthday in Germany. From the professionally meticulous Max Pemsel trying to organize a response at 7th Army headquarters to the teenage fanatics of the 12th SS Panzer Division. From the tragic intelligence officer Alexis von Roehner, helping to ensure German defeat from within, to the brilliantly capable but ultimately helpless Hans von Luck waiting for orders that came too late. The German defence of Normandy failed for reasons that were structural, systemic, and in some respects deliberately engineered by those within the German system who understood that Nazi victory would be a greater catastrophe for Germany and for the world than Nazi defeat. The men who faced justice after the war faced it very unevenly. Some, like Sepp Dietrich and Paul Hausser, were convicted of crimes related to the murders of prisoners and civilians but served relatively brief prison terms and lived comfortably in post-war West Germany, protected in some measure by the political requirements of the Cold War alliance and by the networks of solidarity that former SS officers maintained. Others, like the resistance figures Speidel and von der Heydte, were rehabilitated and given positions of honour in the new democratic Germany. Some, like Rommel, died before any reckoning came, their deaths imposed by the regime they had served. Some, like Canaris and von Roehner, died as martyrs, executed for their opposition to the very system their military service had helped sustain. And some, the majority, simply lived out their post-war lives in relative obscurity, working, raising families, declining to discuss certain things, and carrying with them the memories of what they had done and seen in the service of a criminal state. The beaches of Normandy today are places of pilgrimage and memory. At the Normandy American Cemetery above Omaha Beach, 9,387 American graves overlook the coast. Not far away, at the German military cemetery at La Cambi, 21,222 German soldiers are buried, many of them in the mass graves that reflect the haste and chaos with which the dead were collected after the battle. The graves at La Cambe lie beneath flat basalt stones and dark oak trees, a very different aesthetic from the white crosses of the American cemetery. More austere, less triumphant, appropriate perhaps to a national memory that has no option but to confront the nature of the cause for which those men died. Among the unknown soldiers in German cemeteries scattered across Normandy are men who may have stood in the same bunkers as Werner Pluscat's artillerymen, who may have manned the machine gun positions that swept Omaha Beach on the morning of June 6th, who may have been among the thousands of German defenders who died on D-Day doing their duty to a state that had no right to ask it of them. The question of whether a soldier can be held responsible for the crimes of the state in whose uniform he fights is one that the Nuremberg trials attempted to answer, and that subsequent decades of legal and philosophical thought have continued to wrestle with. The answer that emerged from the post-war period, that there are orders that no soldier is obligated to obey, that superior orders do not excuse the commission of war crimes, that individuals bear moral and legal responsibility for their actions even within military hierarchies, was a genuine moral advance in the laws of war. But it was applied with enormous inconsistency to the men who had served the Third Reich, a fact that has complicated the historical and moral reckoning with the Normandy campaign ever since. Werner Pluscat, the man who saw D-Day first, lived the rest of his life in the West Germany that the invasion he witnessed helped to create. He had not committed war crimes. He had fought a defensive battle against an invasion force, had directed artillery fire against soldiers who were trying to kill him and his comrades, and had been captured or had surrendered in the normal course of war. He bore no legal or moral responsibility for the crimes of the regime he served beyond the general shared responsibility that participation in the system inevitably implies. He lived in a free, democratic Germany, drove on autobahns that had been built partly by slave labour, and watched the American and British soldiers who had landed below his clifftop observation post become the allied partners and protectors of the state that had emerged from the rubble of the Third Reich. He saw himself portrayed in a major Hollywood film. He was interviewed by historians and journalists. He lived a normal, private life in a country that was trying, with various degrees of success and honesty, to understand what it had done and been. On D-Day anniversaries, Normandy fills with veterans, politicians and pilgrims from across the world, and for decades after the battle, German veterans were occasionally among them. Hans von Luck attended several D-Day commemorations at Ranville, where his regiment had fought in June 1944 and was received with a warmth that surprised him and that he described with evident emotion in his memoir. Friedrich von der Heydte lived to attend commemorations as a respected former opponent. These encounters between men who had tried to kill each other 4 decades earlier, conducted with mutual respect and a shared sense of the historical weight of what they had experienced, are among the more hopeful moments in the otherwise often grim post-war story of the German officers of D-Day. They suggest that war, however terrible, does not permanently destroy the possibility of reconciliation between those who have fought on opposite sides, provided that the right political conditions and the necessary passage of time allow for honest reckoning with what happened and why. Werner Pluscat died on June 29, 1986, in a country that was whole, free and democratic, allied to the nations that had invaded below his observation post 4 decades before. The man who first saw D-Day coming, who made that astonished telephone call in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, had lived to see the world that the invasion created. It was not the world that he or any German soldier had fought for. It was a better world than the one that would have existed if the armada he watched approaching through his binoculars had been turned back. And perhaps that is the most important historical judgment of all, that the men who died on the beaches below his observation post and the men who died defending it gave their lives in the service of an outcome that, measured against the alternative, represented the least terrible possible resolution of the catastrophe that Germany had inflicted on the world. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and that the stories of Werner Pluscat and the other German officers who witnessed, commanded and fought during the D-Day landings gave you a deeper understanding of what happened on that world-changing morning in June 1944. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video about what happened to Germany's top field marshals after World War II. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one.